Imagine standing on the muddy banks of the Baltic Sea in the year 1350. You are holding a single handful of coarse gray crystals. To modern eyes, this is just ordinary table salt, something you flick off a pretzeled wrapper without a second thought. But in the 14th century, this handful of white powder is worth more than its weight in polished silver. It is the absolute engine of human survival. Without salt, meat rots into toxic sludge in 3 days. Without salt, fish turns to maggots on the voyage across the North Sea. Without salt, every major city in medieval Europe starves into non-existence before winter turns to spring. Salt is not a seasoning. Salt is the literal preservation device of human civilization. And because it is the most vital commodity on planet Earth, the kings, feudal lords, and holy emperors of Europe have placed an ironclad clamp on it. In nearly every realm, private mining, private harvesting, and private trading of salt is strictly illegal. The monarchies claim absolute crown ownership over every salt pan, every underground mine, and every coastal brine spring. In places like France, the crown introduces the infamous Gabelle, an aggressive tax and compulsory quota that forces every single citizen over the age of 8 to purchase a fixed amount of crown monopolized salt every single year at inflated prices. If you are caught boiling seawater on a private beach to season your broth, you are branded with a hot iron. If you are caught smuggling a 5-pound sack of unsanctioned salt across a provincial border, you are banished, tortured, or sent to rot in the galleys. The system is designed to be an inescapable legal trap, converting a natural element into a permanent tax siphon for royal war chests. So how did a secretive network of medieval salt merchants, coastal guilds, and Venetian trading syndicates look at this absolute royal ban and build a multi-billion-dollar private trading empire under the nose of feudal law enforcement? How did they manipulate transport corridors, invent complex commodity-backed credit vouchers, and control the entire northern herring trade without ever violating the technical letter of royal decrees? To understand the greatest commodity monopoly of the Middle Ages, you have to look past the illusion of crown control and look directly into the hidden machinery of medieval logistics. On the surface, the medieval salt market looked like a simple battle between royal authority and desperate peasantry. Kings issued decrees claiming divine right over all subterranean minerals and coastal flats. Royal guards inspected wagons, searched river barges, and set up armed toll checkpoints along every highway leading into major population centers. The crown told its subjects that salt was expensive because extracting it required immense labor and expensive firewood to boil down brine. The public accepted this as an unfortunate reality of nature. But this surface narrative was a complete, carefully constructed illusion. The secret that the crown and merchant guilds kept hidden from the masses was that salt was not actually scarce in nature. Ocean water was infinite. Coastal flats in southern France and the Mediterranean could yield thousands of tons of sun-dried sea salt for virtually zero energy cost, simply by letting the summer heat evaporate seawater in shallow clay basins. The true cost of salt had almost nothing to do with extraction. The entire inflated price tag was driven by transport friction, government artificial quotas, and intermediate storage monopolies. The real game of wealth was not happening at the salt pan. It was happening in the logistical bottlenecks between the producer and the buyer. If you were an independent trader trying to move 10 barrels of salt up the Rhine River, you did not just face taxes, you faced a wall of institutionalized extortion. Feudal barons erected toll stations every few miles. Local municipalities asserted legal rights of staple, forcing passing boats to unload their entire cargo, display it in the public square for 3 days, and allow local merchants to purchase it at fixed local rates before the rest could be moved further upstream. If you tried to navigate this system using standard merchant techniques, your profit margin vanished before your barge cleared the second river bend. The royal monopoly seemed unassailable because the crown owned the physical points of origin and controlled the main roads. But smart traders realized something profound about medieval governance. Kings were exceptionally wealthy in land and authority, but they were perpetually broke in liquid cash. Maintaining standing armies, building stone fortifications, and funding extravagant royal courts required immediate, reliable gold coin, not future promises of salt tax collection spread over 12 months. The crown possessed absolute legal authority over salt, but it lacked the administrative network to efficiently manage regional distribution, maintain thousands of storage warehouses, or finance the massive upfront logistics of moving bulk goods across continental distances. And right there, in the gap between royal authority and royal cash flow, the medieval salt syndicates found their opening. The merchant guilds did not try to break the crown prohibition on private trade by operating as illegal black market smugglers. Smuggling was low volume, high risk, and impossible to scale into monumental wealth. Instead, they invented a system of institutionalized workarounds that made the crown entirely dependent on private merchant capital while legally transferring absolute control of the physical salt market into private hands. The first major loophole was the creation of the pre-financing lease contract. Merchant syndicates approached cash-starved monarchs with an offer that sounded irresistible. Instead of the crown spending vast sums of gold to pay royal administrators, build storage facilities, and transport salt across unstable territory, the merchant syndicate offered to pay the king a massive, upfront cash lump sum in pure gold coin for the exclusive right to operate and distribute the output of royal salt works for a term of 10 to 20 years. To the king, this looked like instant liquidity without administrative hassle. He got his war money today. But to the merchants, this lease was a license to print wealth. Once the syndicate held the exclusive lease, they controlled the exact outflow rate of the commodity. They intentionally created artificial regional shortages by delaying shipments, holding back reserves in fortified private warehouses, and manipulating regional supply levels to force market prices to absolute legal ceilings. The crown had barred private trade, yet royal authority had effectively leased its total enforcement power to private corporate cartels. The second loophole was even more ingenious and paved the way for modern international banking. The invention of the commodity deposit voucher, or salt bill, transporting thousands of heavy wooden barrels of coarse salt across bandit-ridden medieval roads was slow, dangerous, and expensive. If a merchant fleet carrying physical salt was ambushed or sunk, the entire capital venture collapsed. To eliminate this physical risk, merchant networks operating out of cities like Venice and Lübeck established a paper credit network backed exclusively by stored salt reserves. A merchant in northern Germany could purchase a sealed parchment certificate in Lübeck representing 100 lasts of high-purity salt stored safely in the fortified warehouses of Lüneburg. Instead of physically hauling that salt across Europe, the merchant could trade that paper certificate in Flanders, London, or Novgorod to clear debts, buy textiles, or secure food supplies. Because salt was non-perishable when stored correctly and held guaranteed universal value across every kingdom, these salt-backed paper certificates became a dominant form of high-value international currency among elite traders. The merchants had effectively bypassed wholly usury laws and private trade bans by turning a restricted physical element into an untraceable, highly liquid financial instrument. But the ultimate masterstroke of the medieval salt syndicates occurred in the icy waters of the North Sea and the Baltic, where salt was combined with another fundamental resource to create a world-dominating supply chain empire, the preserved herring cartel. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church enforced strict dietary rules for over 130 days a year, including the 40 days of Lent. On these fast days, eating meat from warm-blooded animals was strictly forbidden. The entire population of Europe, from humble serfs to high-ranking dukes, was legally required to eat fish. Fresh fish spoiled within 24 hours of being pulled from the water, making it impossible to transport inland to major population centers. The only way to feed tens of millions of fasting Christians was salted herring. A single barrel of salted herring required roughly 1/3 of a barrel of high-grade salt to properly preserve the fish for long-term transport and storage. The Hanseatic League, an aggressive commercial alliance of North German merchant guilds, realized that whoever controlled the supply of salt controlled the entire protein market of Europe. The Hanseatic merchants did not just buy salt, they acquired total control over the famous salt springs of Lüneburg in northern Germany. They built the Stecknitz Canal, one of the earliest artificial waterways in medieval Europe, constructed specifically to move massive quantities of Lüneburg salt directly to the Baltic port of Lübeck with minimal transport friction. From Lübeck, Hanseatic fleets loaded with salt sailed directly to the massive seasonal herring fisheries of Scania on the southern tip of modern-day Sweden. Every autumn, tens of thousands of fishermen gathered at Scania to harvest millions of migrating herring. But these local fishermen were completely trapped by the economic trap the Hanseatic League had constructed. The fishermen had the boats and the nets, but they had no salt. If they could not salt their catch within hours, their mountain of fish would turn into a rotting, valueless mass of sludge. The Hanseatic merchants arrived at the beaches with ships packed with Lüneburg salt. They offered the fishermen a brutal economic choice. Sell your raw fish to the Hanseatic syndicate at dirt-cheap prices set by the merchants, or watch your entire harvest rot on the sand. The fishermen had no alternative. The Hanseatic merchants bought the raw fish for next to nothing, salted it on site using their own tax-exempt salt, packed it into standard guild barrels, and shipped it across the entire continent at staggering profit margins. By controlling the salt bottleneck, the Hanseatic League built a multi-billion-dollar trade monopoly that dominated northern European commerce for centuries, dictating terms to kings and controlling the survival of entire nations. Down in the sun-drenched Mediterranean, the Republic of Venice was executing an even more calculated and aggressive salt strategy. While modern history remembers Venice as a city of romance, silk, and spices, the foundational pillar of Venetian power was its ruthless, highly weaponized control of the salt trade, governed by a specialized state office known as the Collegio del Sale, or the Salt Office. The Venetian strategy was simple and terrifying. No ship was permitted to trade in the Adriatic Sea unless it cleared its cargo through Venetian ports and paid tribute to the Venetian salt monopoly. Venice constructed massive, heavily fortified salt storage complexes along its canals. If a neighboring city like Ferrara or Ravenna attempted to build its own independent coastal salt pans to avoid paying Venetian prices, the Venetian Navy did not simply file legal protests. They launched naval raids, smashed the neighboring salt pans, flooded the freshwater canals with mud, and blockaded the rivers until the competing cities submitted to Venetian commercial dominance. Venice used a system of state subsidies known as the salt return to decimate all independent competitors. When Venetian merchant ships sailed to distant ports in the eastern Mediterranean or North Africa to acquire high-value spices, silks, and luxury goods, they faced a major balance of trade issue. Heavy luxury goods were expensive, but they did not weigh enough to properly ballast a large wooden galley returning across stormy seas. The Venetian Salt Office solved this by paying Venetian ship captains a guaranteed state subsidy for every barrel of high-purity sea salt they brought back as ballast from southern salt pans like those in Ibiza, Cyprus, or Apulia. This meant Venetian captains could transport salt back to Venice virtually for free, subsidized by the state. Once the salt arrived in Venice, the Salt Office stored it in their massive central warehouses and controlled the release rate into the Italian hinterland. If an independent salt producer in northern Italy tried to sell salt at 5 silver coins per barrel, Venice would open its warehouse vaults, dump thousands of barrels of subsidized sea salt into the local market at 2 silver coins per barrel, and instantly bankrupt the independent producer. Once the competitor went out of business and dismantled their facilities, Venice would contract the market supply, jack the price up to 10 silver coins per barrel, and recoup their entire expenditure with massive interest. It was predatory pricing executed with military precision 500 years before modern antitrust laws were ever conceived. For nearly 3 centuries, this machine functioned with ruthless efficiency. The salt syndicates of Lübeck and Venice grew richer than the crowned heads of Europe. They owned vast fleets of armed galleys, controlled continental trade routes, built massive stone palaces, and held the financial fate of kingdoms in their hands. But any financial architecture built on artificial legal monopolies, artificial supply bottlenecks, and aggressive economic extortion contains the structural seeds of its own eventual destruction. The golden age of the medieval salt cartels seemed invincible, but by the late 15th century, the systemic risk embedded in the trade began to erupt into catastrophic cascade failure. The first major point of structural fragility was environmental and technological shifting. The entire Hanseatic salt empire relied heavily on the continuous output of the Lüneburg salt springs and the constant availability of massive timber reserves to boil down the brine. Over 2 centuries of continuous, hyper-intensive extraction, the ancient forests surrounding Lüneburg were systematically clear-cut to feed the boiling furnaces. As firewood became scarce, the cost of producing Lüneburg salt skyrocketed. At the exact same time, climatic shifts known as the Little Ice Age began to alter sea temperatures and weather patterns across northern Europe. The vast herring shoals that had migrated into the Baltic waters around Scania every single autumn for centuries suddenly shifted their migration routes into the North Sea, completely bypassing the Hanseatic controlled processing hubs. Overnight, the massive Hanseatic infrastructure of salt warehouses, brine canals, and gutting stations was left servicing an empty sea. The fishermen were gone, the herring were gone, and the astronomical capital invested in the saltfish pipeline vanished into thin air. The second domino to fall was the sudden emergence of international black market smuggling networks, fueled by absolute public fury against oppressive salt taxation. In France, the crown had escalated the Gabelle to absurd levels to finance endless wars with England. The price of legal salt varied wildly between different provinces. In a low-tax province like Brittany, a sack of salt cost a fraction of what it cost in a high-tax province like Anjou just a few miles away. This massive price discrepancy created the largest black market arbitrage economy in human history. Millions of ordinary citizens abandoned farming and legal trades to become faux sauniers, or salt smugglers. They organized covert networks using secret forest paths, trained dogs to carry small bags of untaxed salt across regional borders at night, and built hidden underground salt depots inside ordinary village houses. The French crown responded with horrific violence. They established specialized militarized police units known as Gabelles to hunt down smugglers. Courts handed down brutal sentences, sending tens of thousands of peasants to execution or to sweat as galley slaves. But the economic incentive for smuggling was so vast that no amount of state violence could suppress it. Entire regional economies broke down as populations refused to buy state-sanctioned salt, starving the crown of its expected revenues and throwing provincial governance into complete chaos. The final fatal blow to the medieval salt monopolies came from the sudden expansion of global trade routes and ocean navigation. For centuries, Mediterranean salt cartels like Venice had relied on controlling narrow regional sea lanes and regional inland river corridors. But during the Age of Discovery, maritime technology advanced to the point where massive ocean-going vessels, such as Dutch flights and Portuguese caravels, could easily cross the Atlantic and navigate the open oceans. Dutch merchants, desperate to break the Hanseatic and Venetian strangleholds on preserved food logistics, bypassed the Mediterranean altogether. They sailed their massive fleets directly to the solar salt pans of Portugal, Cape Verde, and the Caribbean. Solar salt evaporated by ocean sun required zero timber to process, making it dramatically cheaper than European boiled spring salt. The Dutch engineered massive specialized ships that could process and salt fish directly on the open ocean while following the shifting herring schools across the Atlantic. The localized logistical bottlenecks that had made Venice and Lübeck the absolute financial masters of Europe were rendered obsolete almost overnight. The physical salt was no longer trapped in regional river corridors. It was floating on global ocean highways, accessible to anyone with an ocean-going vessel. By the time the dust settled and the feudal order collapsed under the weight of political revolution and industrialization, the multi-billion-dollar medieval salt monopolies had dissolved into the pages of history. The ironclad crown decrees, the militarized salt posts, the secret guild voucher networks, and the dominant Venetian Salt Office all faded away. The price of salt crashed from a luxury asset worth more than silver down to a cheap everyday staple costing a few cents per container. But the profound economic legacy of the medieval salt trade survived and permanently transformed the structural architecture of the modern world. You see, the medieval salt merchants were never really selling salt. Salt was merely the physical vessel for something far more significant. They were selling the world's first true prototype of integrated global supply chain management, commodity-backed financial derivatives, and strategic reserve logistics. When you look at modern international trade, you are seeing the direct descendants of the systems engineered by medieval salt syndicates. The paper salt certificates traded in Lübeck to clear cross-border debts laid the direct conceptual foundation for modern bills of lading and paper currency backed by physical commodities. The predatory pricing strategies and state-subsidized shipping loops designed by the Venetian Salt Office became the exact blueprint used by modern multinational corporations to capture global shipping lanes and dominate international trade hubs. Even the structural layout of modern toll infrastructure and state commodity taxation owes its basic origin to the feudal legal battles fought over salt pans. The next time you pick up a salt shaker at a restaurant and scatter a few white crystals over your meal, take a close look at what you are holding. You are not just holding a basic mineral. You are holding the silent, ancient currency that built the financial capital of Europe, bankrolled medieval empires, triggered violent peasant rebellions, and proved that whoever controls the absolute logistics of human survival will always rule the world.